Transgender is identifying as the gender you weren't born with, or the one that was assigned to you by your doctor, such as a woman born with a penis would be told that she's a man, even though that later in life she found out she's a woman, and vice versa. It is identifying with the perceived opposite gender. Years ago, I used to play RuneScape with my buddy, and then I had a natural affinity for playing female characters. But then the neighborhood kids kept calling me gay and, hitting me, stupid kid things. So I regressed it until 2011-ish, and then the barrier that broke down would probably be when I was playing the third installment of the Gears of War series, when one of the characters, Samantha Byrne, was a woman, but she was also one of the guys. In fact, she was manlier than most of them. And at that point, I started thinking, well, I'm a bit like that. And I started looking into gender studies, and I came across transgender. And I started looking into it, and I thought, well, maybe that's what I am. Maybe this is part of me. And I spent a few years kicking it around until I finally decided, yeah, that is part of who I am. It's more of a self-discovery and more like an aha moment, eureka. But I couldn't tell you exactly when I knew, because you regress so much when you're not normal, when you're against normal culture. So I couldn't tell you exactly when. I would definitely say educate yourself. You have the world's knowledge at your fingertips through smartphones, through computers. I know the hardest part for me was telling my family, but then the way I did it wasn't the best. So my advice wouldn't be, I'm telling you something not for your approval. I'm telling you so you know and deal with it. I did that to my dad, and he kind of felt shut out. He didn't really come to terms with it. So my advice would be to educate yourself and to be patient with those you tell. Coming to terms with trans reality is difficult. Mostly because you look around and you have to wonder, are they going to hit me for being different? Is that one going to try and kill me? Or if you're ever flirting with someone or talking to them, you have to wonder, are they talking to me because of my perceived gender? Or if you're already transitioning, are they just looking at you because you're a fetish to them? It's very difficult. And I would say my outlook has definitely darkened. Because when you're the outside looking in, you realize just how much you're going to miss. Even though for you it's better in the long run, you look back and see what you're going to miss. I would say no. It's for some people, not for others. Some people's bodies don't react very well and would reject the surgery, and that's very bad. But other people really want it. It's very important to them, and other people go, so what if I have a penis? So what if I have a vagina? To them, it's more about perceptions. It's what we want to be perceived as. I mean, frankly, what's under the hood, so to speak, doesn't matter as much as how people address and talk to me. Well, the only real difference between a drag queen and a trans person is a drag queen is a man who performs as a woman and is paid to become a woman, whereas a trans woman is a male who is becoming female and is trying to get her day-to-day life as a female, not just to be paid for it and not just for a stage life. So it's kind of like comparing an actual wrestler to a WWE wrestler. The actual wrestler will diet and exercise and train around the clock, but he does it because he wants that as part of his daily life. A professional wrestler goes out there and he puts on this big show for all the fans, and he's just doing it for the fame and the money. So it's more of commonplace versus professionalism. I prefer to wear more effeminate clothing, but there's nothing more nerve-wracking than to be 5'6", a stocky, perceived man trying to go through and buy a bikini for the summer, because everyone kind of looks at you all weird. But it really depends on the individual, because clothes don't really have a gender. You buy clothes, they're your clothes. And clothes can be made for specific measurements, but who's to say a skinny man can't wear skinny jeans, or a larger woman can't wear cargo khakis? I would say no, because in biology you don't have gender, you have sex. And sex is defined as male, which means you have a sperm, or female, which means you have an egg. And we are seeing cases where trans men get pregnant, and trans women are the quote father unquote. So it doesn't really match with biological terms. And gender is much more defined by the culture you're living in, not by what a textbook says. And to give an example, the cultural norms of an American woman would be vastly different than an Iranian woman. Yet you don't say, well, she's less of a woman because she acts this way. I wouldn't say biology plays a major factor, but again, it's more about cultural norms. In India, you have what's called a Hajish, which is a third gender. It's a man who dresses as a woman and does all womanly duties, but still says that he's a man. And now India has officially recognized them as a third gender. Let's dissect that transgender a little bit, because a lot of people do have to question if they are or not. And there's a reasonable amount of people who go, no, that's not me. I have to rethink how I'm going about this. And sometimes they have a complete 180. And some people just have to prove to themselves that they are or they are not. And the only way they can is by trying it out, so to speak. That would be a question that's too dependent on where you're from and the local culture and, frankly, how well you trust people. I know one of the first few people I spoke to was a psychologist, but I know that the psychologists in our area are more progressive thinking, and they're kinder to sexual deviancy. to put it in more conservative terms. Whereas we live in a very conservative area that frowns upon it. And a lot of places will flat out fire you for it. So the best advice I could say on talking to someone is, until you're ready to come out, someone you would only trust with something as important as your social security number or your bank PIN. Concerning rights for transgender is hard to describe, because whatever isn't written in the Constitution, and some things that are, still are only privilege and for trans people. And I say privilege in the sense that it can be taken away. And to give an example, a black man cannot be fired for being black, but a trans man could be fired for being trans. And that's because in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Congress of the time didn't have the forethought of trans people becoming more culturally relevant, and therefore were left out of the Civil Rights Agreement. So what that means is, and today, a black man cannot be fired for being black, but a trans man could still be fired for being trans. And to give an example, actually this is in the bill, you could not hire a female to be a male washroom attendant. But if they're a trans man and they dress and act like a man, but they still have a vagina, under the Civil Rights Agreement, they are legally not allowed to take that job. And there are all sorts of legalities that, under technical terms, don't apply to trans people. It's a gray area. And while many equal opportunity employers will keep them on, more reserved businesses, a lot of mom and pop stores, a lot of the smaller businesses will outright fire them, because customers will see that and a good chunk will feel disgusted and stop shopping there. So, as for privileges versus rights, it's hard to say if trans people have any rights at all. So, on gender studies in colleges, it could be a very good thing or it could be a very bad thing. We have American videos on evolution of human beings, and we have Nazi evolution videos on human beings. It's really depends on how people put a twist on it. And some people would argue that it's unnatural and it's counter-evolutionary. And while frankly I believe they're quite wrong, enough people believe it that it could get into gender studies and it could help harbor more hostile attitudes towards trans populaces. So it could really swing either way. As for feminism and how it perceives trans women, there are some, we call them TERFs, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Rights Feminists. And they argue that because trans women can't have periods or don't have a uterus and can't give birth, that they aren't real women, which is asinine, because trans women can still be drugged and raped, they can still be kidnapped, they can still be forced into the same situations as, quote, normal, unquote, women. And I think the biggest problem is the more reserved feminists see trans women having male privilege. And that's simply not the case, because once they come out as trans, they lose all their higher societal standings, and they are one step above trash to most people. On the subject of documentation for trans people, it's a very touchy subject. And the reason being is, if I'm passing, and I define passing as more people than not will perceive me as a woman. If I am a passing woman and I take a flight to Russia to see the Red Square, and they see my passport has an M instead of an F, I could be in all sorts of legal hot water, because on one hand, the authorities see a woman and the passport says it's a man. And culturally, a lot of areas in Russia or Iran or China or a lot of places in India or even the United States are very hostile towards transsexuals, transgender. And the difference is a transsexual has had surgery that has corrected their reproductive organs. And transgender is someone who simply identifies as the opposite gender. You very well could be mugged, beaten, or even killed in these foreign lands, such as executions in Iran are permitted, in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. In Russia, you could be jailed for sexual deviancy, for, quote, convincing young people that the traditional sexual standing is incorrect, unquote. And it could be very dangerous that they don't have corrective legal actions on these documents. But on the other side, there are more progressive nations, such as Canada, which after corrective surgery will automatically update it. Or in Iceland, which will allow you to put whatever gender you prefer. Or in Nepal, you can put O for other. So it's a real pendulum swing, but in the United States, it's after a very expensive corrective surgery. And the difference between America and Canada is the Canadian government will subsidize a very large portion of corrective surgery and hormonal treatments and most of the transition, whereas in America, many insurances count that as cosmetic services and don't cover it. So a $5,000 treatment in Canada ends up being well over $10,000, $15,000 treatment stateside. Drug use is really prevalent among trans youth, and it's because they're growing up in a world they don't fully understand yet. Most people don't understand the world around them until their mid-30s, and you have someone who's 15 years old discovering life and finding out about themselves that they're not the gender that everyone calls them to be. And now they're trying to figure out how to live and please family and please parents and all of that, but while being yourself. And a lot of trans youth will turn to things, not just like marijuana, but more dangerous, like higher level drugs, ecstasy, painkillers, absorbent amounts of alcohol, because it takes the edge off of life. And it keeps it to the point where it's almost barely living for them. I feel as there is no time limit for maximum or minimum, because if you have a child, and he's 4 years old. He's a male, we'll say male. But he likes to play with dolls. He likes to hang out with mom all the time and wear her makeup and try her jewelry on. That could very well be an early indication. Now, the child won't have the knowledge to say, I'm a woman, call me a woman. But because he doesn't, or I guess in this case, she doesn't understand the idea of transgender, or gender for that matter. And if I remember correctly, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt's daughter announced that he's transgender and that he's identifying as a man now. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, Caitlyn Jenner was past 60 when she decided to transition. So there's no really set point in life where you can go, by this time they have to acknowledge it or not, because it's organic, it's fluid. You can't just tell water to sit in this place and not move ever. It just doesn't work like that. Genes can only play so much about how someone will think and perceive and how they act. I would say that is much more on culture and geography, because a Pennsylvanian, if a woman had twins and one was in Pennsylvania and one was in Texas, they would not grow up acting exactly the same. One would talk with the Texan drawl and the other one would have a Pennsylvanian drawl. So I would argue blank slate, because culture has a much higher impact, especially with parents to children. Pronouns are important to trans people. They're important to everyone. A man wouldn't like it if a cis man, and cis meaning that you correspond with the gender that aligns with your reproductive organs. If I walked up and started calling him a woman, she, her, he would become offended, because that's not who he is. And what baffles me is that people will see someone walking a dog and go, what's her name? And the owner will go, well, it's a he. And then they automatically fix it to he. But if it's with a person, it suddenly becomes abstract or surreal to them. And I can understand if you're a father or mother and your child comes out to you, that you have to realign yourself. You have to correct your pronouns. Even though it's difficult and you slip up, it's important, because that means you're acknowledging the steps that your child is taking to growing up, or your friend, or your coworker. It's more of a subtle way of saying that I'm here for you. But when you purposely, or even if it's unintentional, use the wrong pronoun, it's sort of saying, you're not this because I know better. And it's very insulting. It's harder to describe than just that.